Good morning. I'm sorry we're starting a little bit late today. We had a few technical challenges. I think we've got those worked out, and so we're going to get started here and see if we can run through this really quickly. I'm not, just by way of beginning, I'm not sure what you all have done that people were upset about, but clearly somebody is angry with you because they have dictated that for the next few Fridays, you're going to start your weekend listening to me for a couple of hours. So I was under the impression that the law forbade cruel and unusual punishments, but that clearly does not apply to you. And so we're going to suffer together here for a little bit. By way of introduction, my name is Armin Drummond. Normally Lance would have been up here to introduce, and he's not here today. As coincidentally, Bart is not here today. So clearly they knew how bad this was going to be for you and decided to escape quickly. Anyway, as I said, my name is Armin Drummond. I'm relatively new here to working with the state of Utah and definitely to DWS. Been with DWS HR field office since November. And prior to that, I spent the last 10 years working as the Director of Human Resources for a small hospital district in Wyoming. So new to the state, more or less. New to DWS, definitely. Not so new to human resources or the challenges that are there. Our discussion today is going to be on performance improvement and discipline issues, and so it's kind of a natural progression from the things that we've been talking about in these meetings up till now. So Michelle talked to you about recruitment and gave you tools that can be used to screen through the various applicants and make sure that you're picking the very most highly qualified people that you can for the positions that you want. Aaron then talked to you about interviewing and selection and taking that group of people that are highly skilled and capable and have all of the technical capabilities that you need and finding the one who has the right mindset and the right personality and the right critical thinking skills to be able to mesh with your team and become a really highly productive individual. Krista talked to you about retention and once you get that person into the workplace, some of the tools that you can use to make sure that you're acknowledging them and rewarding them and giving them the best opportunities to want to stay in their position. And you know, people stay when they can think that they are being paid well and appreciated and mentored and valued and challenged, when they feel like they have a sense of mission about what they're doing, and when they're promoted, empowered, involved, and most importantly, trusted. And then from there, we're going on to the discussions that we're having here. And so we're going to today, we're going to today be talking about performance and conduct, performance improvement, disciplinary actions, and kind of working off of that. And this is really a very natural offshoot off of Bart's last discussion with you. He talked about things like employee development and performance management. And those three things, employee development, performance management and performance improvement, and disciplinary action, form kind of the three cogs of the gears that represent what we would consider your supervisory toolkit, or the tools that you have once the screening and the selection and the onboarding process are done, the tools that you have as supervisors to best get the most performance out of your employees. And so Bart took kind of this left half. He talked about employee development and he talked about the performance management portion of the middle cog there. And quite coincidentally, or maybe not, those also happen to be the parts that are fun, the parts that make an employee think, oh, this guy's wonderful and I really like working here and I get so much enjoyment out of my job and I just love it. And then he left for me to talk to you about the right-hand side, which is the performance improvement and the disciplinary parts, which are the parts that nobody likes and that make your employees think, this is an evil, horrible person that I work for and they're so rude and they're so unbelievable and I can't believe that I work here and I just hate my job. Nice of Bart. I appreciate that. So just as a recap, employee development involves those fun things. It involves taking and enhancing that employee's skills, making them grow and develop, building their experience, creating a succession plan so that as they grow and become capable of taking on higher and better jobs, they have the skills that are necessary to move forward, and that you can then bring somebody else in to take their place. You're working to strengthen and unify and unite your team and make it so that y'all, if you're not the best of friends, at least you can live with each other and have a good time and enjoy where you're at. And you're trying to build that morale. Performance management takes two different sides, or performance management is the left side here. This is what Bart decided to talk to you about, and it's that technical piece, that instilling that sense of accountability, knowing that what they are doing, they're going to be held responsible for, and that there is an expectation for performance there. You're going to measure those achievements. You're trying to produce the results. And most importantly here, on this performance management side, we're trying to steer success. We're trying to make sure that that employee has everything in place that they need to be successful in their job. So then, for the performance improvement side then, or the right-hand side of this particular cog, sometimes even when somebody has all of the tools that they really should need, or at least we think they have all of the tools that they really should need to be successful, sometimes they're not. And we need to be able to address those performance issues. And it's not necessarily they're doing anything wrong in the sense that they're violating a rule or they're doing something to harm your team, but they're just not reaching the performance expectations. So what we want to do with a performance improvement plan is to provide an opportunity where we can increase the support that they receive and increase the monitoring that they receive so that we can maybe identify what are the things that are causing them to have that lack of performance. And then we want to improve their results and make that employee reach the expectations that are standard for their team and their job. We don't want to lower our expectations of employees. We want to raise their performance to meet those expectations. And critically important, you can notice on here, that our goal in a performance improvement plan is also to steer success. We want to give them every opportunity to correct whatever they are doing or not doing that is harming their performance so that they can be a high-performing, valued member of our team. So a performance improvement plan, very importantly, is intended to be a non-punitive action that we take to improve the overall performance of an individual in a particular job. Now, to contrast that, we want to talk about discipline. Discipline is entirely different. Discipline involves a choice of an employee to engage in an act of willful misconduct. And willful misconduct is defined as a knowing violation of a reasonable and uniformly enforced rule or policy. And when you have a person who is knowingly violating a known and reasonable policy, then you have the opportunity to get real with that person and to address that specific thing and get correction immediately. And so where performance improvement is designed to be non-punitive, discipline, by contrast, is designed specifically to be punitive and to engage that employee into correcting that behavior immediately. So look at this, and as I was looking at this slide just a few minutes before I came down here, I realized that the gears here are set up exactly the same way as the previous slide that showed employee development, performance improvement and management, and discipline. And I don't want you taking and looking at this slide and thinking, oh, then employee development is a supervisor's role. Performance management and performance improvement are HR's role, and management deals with discipline. That is not the case here. These are all roles for you. That's just an unfortunate coincidence in that slide. But I do want you to see on this slide that each of those three groups have a critical role in each of those areas, and we're going to talk about what those roles specifically are. So let's talk about some specific, let's see, we want to skip that. So some specific performance issues. Let's say you have an individual who they have an expectation once they receive information from a customer on that customer specific case that they should be having some kind of a result, some kind of a communication with that customer within, let's say, 3 days, as an example. And that person is not achieving that. They're not getting back to that customer for 4 or maybe 5 days. That's an issue that's not really willful misconduct. It could be just a function of time management and process management. And so you're going to look at that as a performance issue. Similarly, if you've got an individual who is not reaching the accuracy measurements for their eligibility determinations, again, it's not that they're doing anything that's specifically against rule, it's just that they're not managing their workload properly, and so they're not using the tools available to make sure they're getting the right choices selected. So it's a performance issue. Sluggish project completion, again. Contrast that then with conduct issues, which could be accessing a fiance's public assistance case. Right? There is never an occasion, or almost never an occasion, when that would ever be acceptable to access any relative's public assistance case. It's right there in the rules. You sign off your understanding of that rule during your orientation and onboarding. So every employee knows right from the get-go that's not allowed. So if a person does it, even for a brief tiny moment, they are engaging in a willful choice to violate that rule. It's a conduct issue. Tardiness or absence without notification. Now, sometimes people are tardy. That's reality. Life is what life is, and sometimes traffic sucks and you don't get to work quite when you thought you were going to, and so sometimes that happens. Absences happen. People get sick. People have to call off. Those are not things that are inherently wrong, but if they're not providing the required notification so that you as a supervisor don't know where they are, they just haven't shown up, that is a misconduct issue. The policies and rules of the department and of the state require that appropriate notice be given in such a case. And so if a person is not providing the notification they need, it's a willful choice, that's a conduct issue, and so we're going to look toward discipline for dealing with them. We don't have to go through all these. Intentional falsification of any record would again be something that a person should go into that work knowing that's wrong. But there's also specific rules that address that. So on the left-hand side here, we're going to deal with these performance issues with an performance improvement plan, whereas on the right-hand side, we're going to address these conduct issues with a disciplinary action. So let's look and kind of compare and contrast the difference between them. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but a performance improvement plan is designed to be non-punitive, as we said. The goal is to develop that employee to get them up to the standards that are expected. And generally, it's going to be, this number is not set in stone, but usually a performance plan is at least 60, sometimes as long as 90 days in length. Sometimes it can be actually significantly longer depending on the nature of the performance problem and how often those numbers can be tracked. And if a person then fails that 60-day performance improvement plan, then they would get a second extended performance improvement plan, this one normally 30 days in length. As contrasted with discipline, it's designed to be punitive. Its goal is to punish that wrongdoing and to then modify that behavior so it doesn't happen again. And it's very short term. It's designed for immediate change. If we were dealing with a suspension, that suspension could be up to 30 days in length by rule and law. But if you're looking at thinking that, boy, a 30-day long suspension would be a good idea here, you probably are looking at the wrong discipline. You probably should be looking at termination, not sending somebody home for that length of time. But regardless, the idea is to make sure that it's reasonably short and that it engages the person in correcting that behavior immediately. All right, so got to make sure I don't lose. So let's do the legal part. I'm not an attorney, by the way, and so this does not constitute legal advice, but we're going to talk about the rules and the laws as it applies. So DHRM Rule 477.10.2 tells us that when an employee's performance is below standards, we are allowed to engage them in a performance improvement plan, and it has to meet the following rules. First, it has to be for a designated period of time established for that improvement. That's that 60-day window, and if it needed to be longer, we would just in writing with the plan itself specify to that employee exactly how long this performance improvement plan is going to last. It has to have an opportunity for remediation. What does that mean? What does the word remediation mean in this context? I'm here for 2 hours. I can wait for you longer than you want to wait.
It has to give them an opportunity to it has to give them an opportunity to improve the issue, give them time to show that they can correct the performance.
Okay, that's the second part of that. What does a person need to do before they can correct a problem?
Be clarified on what the problem is.
What the problem is and
what they need to do.
What the solution is. They have to receive the appropriate instruction, they have to receive the appropriate training, they have to receive the appropriate mentorship. You have to give them a chance to learn whatever it is they don't know or don't understand that would allow them to then be successful. That's remediation. You're kind of removing those expectations, providing them the training, and then putting that expectation back on them. It has to have defined performance expectations. We want to tie this to specific, objective, measurable numbers that says that you need to reach a certain standard that we can draw from reports that are not based on my personal feelings on the given day, but that are objective in nature, that will allow us to say, yes, this person is or is not achieving the expected goals. It needs to involve close supervision and include regular feedback, and we're going to talk about what that regular feedback means in just a minute. It needs to have a notice that disciplinary action for failure to improve. So I told you a minute ago that a performance improvement plan is designed and intended to be non-punitive. That's true. However, on the flip side of that, if an employee fails to improve as required once they're placed on that improvement plan, then disciplinary action can and probably will follow. So once they're placed on that plan, it's not just a, boy, we'd really like you to get better. It's an expectation. You have to improve and meet the standards within this window, or disciplinary action is going to happen. And then the evaluations at the conclusion have to be written, and they have to, they have to be written, they have to be documented in that person's personnel file, so that in the future we can look back and see, did they improve, were they successful? So let's talk about a couple of those. Oh, let's see, there's one more thing in here. This one, I just wanted you to be aware of this. It's not really critical to the discussion for today, but a performance improvement plan also can provide for other remedies, not just improving that person's performance. If during a performance improvement plan we are able to identify that there is a critical skill set, a critical ability, critical knowledge that really cannot be achieved in that window, but it's an employee that we really don't want to lose. They're hardworking, they're dedicated, they're worthwhile keeping, they're just not in the right place for them to be successful, and we can't get them there in a performance improvement plan window. There is the option of providing reassignment to some other job. Now, it's got to be the right employee. That's not available for just everybody across the board. But if you've got somebody who really is a great employee and they've just found themselves in a role that is not right for them, this performance improvement plan by DHRM rule does allow for the possibility that it would involve a reassignment to some other job. Use of appropriate leave, that's essentially trying to tell us that if we're able to identify that there are medical issues, for example, that are impeding a person's ability to perform, that would give us a chance to identify that and say, maybe this person needs to be talking about an FMLA leave to get them some period of time to get better, or some other kind of appropriate leave to get them to the point where they can perform appropriately. All right. Whoops, I don't want to go to, oh good, it didn't. All right. So it talked about regular meetings, regular communication with that employee. Regular in this sense, I want you to just kind of default to should be weekly. It's possible, depending on circumstances, that would need to be a longer or maybe even a shorter period of time. Maybe it's an employee that lives in a very rural area and making that trip to meet them face-to-face weekly is just not really reasonable. Possible, but default to the idea of weekly. Weekly, face-to-face, documented, and worthwhile. What do those last two things mean? Let's start with documented. When I say that the performance improvement plan weekly meeting is documented, what is going to constitute documented?
Taking notes and providing some type of copy record of the encounter and what occurs.
Okay. So if I'm sitting down with my employee and my note consists of, I met with Bart today, talked about his PIP, everything's okay. Is that documented? It's written.
It's not worthwhile.
I can go back to it. We're not worthwhile yet. Does that even count as documented? No. Documented means in the PIP, in the PIP, you've established the numbers that they have to reach that you're going to measure that determines whether or not they're successful. That weekly meeting documentation needs to establish what the numbers were, where they fall into that, and whether or not that is qualifying as successful or not. It also needs to involve any additional plan that you're saying, we're going to provide you with a mentor this week, we're going to send you to XYZ training, whatever it is that the plan is for that next week needs to be in that plan. You want to be able to, if it's ever brought up later, pull out paperwork and say, on April 1st, I met with the employee. We talked about the following things. I informed them their performance was as follows. I told them this was unsuccessful or successful, and then we made the following plan moving forward. This is not a short process. You are not going to do this in 2 minutes' time. Okay? That leads us to the idea of worthwhile, and that's the same basic concept. You need to be spending time with that employee. You need to be giving them the tools they need to be successful. You need to be making sure they understand exactly where they stand and what things need to change in order to get them to the point that you need them, or what things need to stay the same so that they don't fall back into poor performance again. Again, it's very open, very upfront, very direct, very professional and kind, but they should walk out of there knowing exactly where they stand and where their performance is in relation to that plan and their job. Okay. Then you have a midpoint evaluation. This is in addition to your weekly meetings. You're going to sit down. You might happen at the same time as a scheduled weekly meeting, but it's a separate document, a separate plan. You're going to sit down with that employee, and halfway through that formal PIP, you are going to sit down with them and indicate exactly where they are, exactly what needs to still happen, what the plan is to get them successful, and they need to sign that document, and you need to sign that document, and that document needs to be sent to Human Resources to be included in their personnel file. Okay? And then the end point. We're going to determine whether or not they were successful. If they're successful, we're going to congratulate them and warn them. What are we warning them about? They were just successful. Why warn?
Because they're successful, we know they can be successful and they understand now, and so moving forward, the expectation is a lot higher because we've gone through the full process of getting them to that point where everybody's on the same page and we've now defined what success is and they've been able to prove they can do it.
Right, exactly. They have now proven through that performance improvement plan that they can be successful and they can meet those expectations. So barring some major change in processes, like installing an entirely new computer system, which would be an exception, but as long as things remain fundamentally the same, if a person's been on a performance improvement plan and they successfully complete it, then if they have the same essential problems later on, do they get to go on a performance improvement plan again? No, because they've proven they can be successful. They've proven they know what is necessary to be successful. They've proven that they understand all of the elements involved. Then that's a misconduct issue at that point. They're choosing at that point not to do the things that would make them be successful. It's not that there's a lack of skill or understanding. So once they've successfully passed a PIP, if that same performance measure drops below acceptable standards again, it's a discipline issue, not a let's do another PIP issue. Yes?
In regards to that, what if a staff member has been successful off a PIP? I guess what's the difference between someone being successful and then dropping and proving they can be successful on a PIP? Is it just that it's documented then?
Yes. Essentially, the primary difference is that in the PIP, we were able to document specifically that we provided all of the appropriate training to make sure that they had every tool necessary to be successful, and then they showed that they were capable of using all of those tools and can be successful. So at that point, you can't really claim that there's a skill lack or an ignorance issue or a failure to understand. It's a choice not to use the tools that we've already provided. Any other questions?
You indicated that one of the options is a reassignment if you determine that they're just in the wrong job.
Yes.
Do they normally take a pay cut with that reassignment, or do they normally keep their pay?
That would depend on where they're being reassigned to. They would not, in a reassignment, have an absolute claim on maintaining their income. And so if they were being reassigned to a position that paid less, it would be very possible, correct me if I'm wrong, very likely that that would involve a pay cut. But it's possible that they would stay the same. It really, the key element to all performance improvement plans, from their design to the measurement to the determination of successful or unsuccessful and the plan going forward, all of that is designed to be very specific to the employee you're dealing with and the job they have and the problem that they have. And each one is designed from scratch for that individual. It's not a cookie cutter kind of a thing. And so where one person might be able to receive one option, another person might not, depending on what their specific circumstances were.
Thank you.
Okay. So we talked about how failing a PIP, or that the PIP is not designed to be punitive, but that failing a PIP can result in punitive actions. So as a rule, DWS normally gives a 1-day suspension without pay if a person fails their initial performance improvement plan. They are then placed on a usually 30-day extended performance improvement plan, and if they fail that, then they would be terminated from state employment. So it's not intended to be punitive, but it can result in punitive, because if they're just not able to be successful, and there are reasons why we cannot or don't feel like we want to engage in a reassignment or any other option, then we're not just going to keep that person around. An employee once hired has to be able to be successful in their position. Being a government employee is not a just guarantee of perpetual employment no matter what you do, despite the myths to the contrary. Okay, so as you go through this, please just be aware that in human resources, we have templates to handle every one of these issues. or can help you develop one if we don't have something specific. And we do these quite often, and so we are available anytime you need to call. Let's discuss them. Let's build the plan specific to that employee. Let's make it so that they have the best chance of being successful. And please openly and regularly do this. You're not impeding our work. You're not becoming a hindrance to us. This is what we do. This is our job. This is one of the major reasons why we're here. And so we want to act as subject matter experts and help you engage in with your employees and get them what they need to be successful. You're not being a burden when you call us. Okay. As we go through that, I do want to give you as a supervisor just a little bit of counsel, a little bit of warning to just recognize that because these things can result in changes in a person's employment status, they can result in punishment, they can result in termination, they can result in negative job actions. It is very likely that others, your managers, the executive director, the Attorney General's office, Career Service Review Office, other people could have occasion to be looking at your performance in managing your employees' performance improvement plan and seeing how well you did your job to give them those tools. And so you just want to make sure that at every juncture, you're doing everything you can to make sure that they have everything they need to be successful, and that their failure is their failure, not something that can be tied to you and said, well, if you had been better at giving them the proper training, the proper support, they would have been able to be successful. Okay. I don't know. So before we go much the way it is and why there's this much red tape involved in these processes. Due process, which is really what the issue is here, is a result of a combination of federal and state laws. And so the U.S. Constitution, 14th Amendment, establishes that the state cannot deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And we are the state. You are a state agency of the state of Utah. You're a governmental entity, and so we as an employer under the Constitution cannot deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without giving them that due process to establish that what we're doing is reasonable and fair. And Utah Code, under the Personnel Management Act, has established that career service is a property right that cannot be that a person cannot be deprived of without that process. And so the Utah Code takes that and establishes the exact specifics of what is required in order to meet that legal requirement of due process and make sure that a person has received all of their rights. And if we choose to deprive them of the property of their employment, that we have done so in accordance with law. Due process does not mean that you cannot take action against an employee. It does not mean, as I said a minute ago, that government employment is a guarantee of perpetual employment. It just means that you have to go through the appropriate process to establish that your choices and decisions have been reasonable and based on real business needs, not just your personal opinion about a given employee. So under the law, under Utah law, a career service employee has to be given notice prior to imposing any form of disciplinary action. That's done in a letter. It's an intent to discipline. You provide that to the employee. That letter establishes what they've done wrong and what you plan on doing as a result of it. And then they get a period of time. Under Utah law, it's established as 5 days to respond to that letter or to ask for a hearing on their behalf. They don't have to have the hearing within the 5 days. They just have to have said, I want to be heard within that 5-day period, and then we go and schedule that. That person has a right under law to have their manner. At the end of that 5 days, if they have not given notice that they want to be heard, then you proceed forward. If they give some kind of a written response, you consider that. You legitimately sit down, look at what they've given, and give it due consideration. Say, does this change the nature of the problem? And if they ask for a hearing, then we schedule that and move forward. But it's the same thing. Within that hearing, they're allowed to share what they feel is important to that issue, and then a decision is made whether or not what they've shared materially changes the issue, so that we need to change what our intention for discipline is. But it's not a guarantee that it would. And often we do proceed straightforward and go ahead with the discipline despite them saying, I don't agree with this, I don't like this, you're being mean to me. Okay, but we're still going to do it. Okay, in Utah, under DHRM rule, there are 4 official levels of discipline. And these are the only 4 that really exist under DHRM rule. There's the letter of reprimand, there's a suspension without pay, which can under rule go to as long as 30 days, but that would be very, very rare, and I just can't even imagine a time when you'd be looking at 30 days as opposed to termination. You could demote a person to a different position, or you can dismiss them entirely from state employment. So those are the 4 levels, and usually you will hear the term applied to them as progressive discipline. And quite frankly, we want, as much as possible, for you to follow a progressive disciplinary process, which means that you start down here before you jump up to here. But that is not a requirement. We take the sum total of the circumstances and look at what is really happening there and determine the best appropriate discipline. You could have, for example, a person who accesses their family member's case for benefits. That's going to go directly to a suspension, probably 5 days. It would be very unlikely that it would be less than 5 days. There won't be a written reprimand. It's going to be a suspension. We start there. And so you don't have to start at the lowest level, but there needs to be a reason why you're not. There needs to be a compelling reason why you're not following that progressive. We like to see that at best. But when you're doing your decision, you want to consider a whole bunch of different things. So, are we consistently applying our rules and standards across the board to everybody in similar positions so that everybody has the same expectations? Do they have prior knowledge of the rules and the standards? How severe is the infraction that they've engaged in? Is this a violation of just an internal policy that is fairly minor, or are we talking about a violation of law? Have they done this repeatedly? Is this just something that they've ignored us when we've asked them to change their behaviors? So for example, with the repeated nature of the violations, let's say you have a rule, and I don't know what exactly the rule is for your individual department, your individual teams, but let's just presume that you have a rule that says that an employee is not allowed to clock in any more than 5 minutes before the scheduled start of their shift or 5 minutes after the start of their shift. And if they do, then they're subject to discipline. And you have an individual who a few times this week has clocked in a little bit late or a little bit early, I don't care which. And you're sitting there and you're looking at that, you see that on their timesheet, and you go, oh, I gotta address this with them. You don't necessarily have to jump right to a written reprimand. Maybe they're relatively new. You know they got told this rule during their orientation period, or their orientation and onboarding process, but they also got told about 6 billion other things. It's kind of like drinking from the fire hose, and so you're like, all right, maybe this didn't stick in their head. So now you sit down with that employee and you say, hey, Bart, you need to be here on time. You can't be clocking in early, you can't be clocking in late. And our rule says you have to be within 5 minutes either side of your clocking time. 5 minutes before is okay, 5 minutes after is okay, but anything beyond that window is not acceptable and will result in discipline. You've done that, now they know. If they do it again, that's a repeated violation. Now we're just going to jump right into discipline and move forward a lot faster. If they've received other warnings, oral or otherwise, or have an issue, we kind of just went over that, especially if they've had other discipline for a similar issue. You know, if somebody had a written reprimand for being unprofessional with a customer, and then 6 months, a year, 2 years later, they did a similar sort of a thing, you're not going back to written reprimands. They don't get, you know, it doesn't just drop off after a little while. Oh, well, you haven't told somebody off in at least, 4 years, so it's okay this once, we'll just give you another reprimand. No, we're going to go right to suspension. Their past work record, it may seem unfair at the surface level, but if you really think about it, it's not. High-performing employees sometimes do get a little bit more leeway than low-performing employees because you know that they're at least trying. And so the level of willful is probably a little less. It may not be, and you may not give them that leeway, but people who are really good and show up every day and show up early and stay late and do everything you need to and take on extra assignments and are willing to put forth every effort and make sure that they dot every I and cross every T, and you just know that their work is stellar, yeah, they get a little bit more leeway than people who are consistently poor performers. Sucks maybe, but get over it. The effect on the agency's operations, if this is something that can dramatically affect our ability to continue business into the future, potential violation for causing damage to persons or property, all those kinds of things can do it. Now, we had a little bit of trouble because I kind of messed around with these slides to make this a little bit easier to read, and then I couldn't connect to my drive on my computer when we got it down here. So you're seeing kind of the older version of this, but I do want you to see it. This is kind of the disciplinary process map, and you can see that it's fairly long and fairly complex, but what I want you to be able to see, and I don't know if you can read this very well at all, so I'll kind of go through a little bit of it. Really, the only important parts for you are just the ones in yellow. Everything that's in white or in the tan is kind of happening in the background, and you're not really having to deal with any of that. So we start down here, an employee commits a conduct issue. They've done something that is knowingly wrong. You're going to jump right up to agency management here. That's you. You're going to contact HR regarding that issue. And then HR down here, you're not going to do this part, but you're going to be involved in it. We're going to create that case file. We're going to start gathering the information that's there. We're going to look at how the agency has dealt with similar issues in the past to create a list of comparables that we can share with you so you know what your options are in moving forward. And then we're going to make a recommendation as to what we think the best path forward is, what level of discipline and how that should be done. And then we're going to help you develop a disciplinary intent, decision, and letter, which you're going to give to the employee down here. They're going to receive that, and they get to consider that and decide what they want to do. As I said previously, they have 5 days to decide if they want to give some kind of a response to that. If they want to give a response, they've got to at least, if it's a written response, they need to provide it in that 5-day window. If it's that they want to have a hearing on it, they need to have called to try to schedule that hearing within that 5-day window. If they have no response, they just ignore, they let the 5 days lapse, they haven't done anything to address that, then you will draft the letter actually imposing that discipline and provide that to them, and then impose whatever level of discipline that we've done, document that and put it into their personnel file. If they do have a response, then you're going to consider that. And I really mean that sincerely. Sometimes I think people think that it's just a paper process. They receive a written response from an employee, they glance at it, they put it down, they go, yeah, don't have to worry about it. You really do have to listen to what that employee is saying. You have to consider what's going on. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Some years ago, I had a supervisor come down to me absolutely furious. He was just on fire. And he says, I want to get rid of John. John was one of his employees. John's has no call, no showed 3 Mondays in a row. And I looked at our policy, And our policy says that at the third no-call, no-show, we can terminate. And I'm sick of him. I'm sick of his crap. I want him gone. Where's the paperwork? What do I sign? I want him fired. Let's go. And so I said to the supervisor, I said, okay, let's look at this a little bit. When John was absent 2 weeks ago on Monday, and you noticed that, then he came to work on Tuesday. What did he say? What do you mean? What did he say? When you said to him, where were you yesterday? What did he say? I didn't talk to him. Why? Well, I was really busy. I mean, we're in the middle of our health fair preparations. I didn't have time. I couldn't spend that kind of time with him. I just didn't talk to him. I said, all right. The next Monday, when he doesn't show for the second time, you noticed it. So the next day, when he showed up on Tuesday for his shift, what did he say? I didn't talk to him. I was so mad I just wanted to punch him in the head. I couldn't stand being anywhere near him, so I just didn't talk to him. I said, all right. So yesterday, he didn't show up again. Today, we're going to have a talk with him. We're going to find out what it is that's causing him to be absent. I said, you don't have to accept his excuse. You don't have to accept it as real. You don't have to accept it as reasonable. You don't have to change your mind because he's been no call, no show for 3 Mondays, and so you have a right to act at this point, but we're going to listen to him. We pulled down the employee, said, John, your supervisor has noticed that you have no call, no showed for 3 Mondays in a row. His intention is to fire you. Can you explain to us what's going on and what's causing this? John's looking at his supervisor like, you are an idiot. And he turns to me and he says, I've been at the class that he is requiring I attend and that you guys are paying the tuition for me to go to. And his supervisor went like this. Oh, yeah, I forgot about that. Did it change the intention? You betcha. So you have to listen. That employee, I apologized profusely to that individual, sent him back up to work, went up later and talked to him again to apologize again, and then between that time, he and that supervisor and I had about a 3-hour discussion, we'll call it, about the need to have those conversations. You need to be open to listening because sometimes things are different than what you thought. One conversation, 15 seconds long, the first Tuesday that first no call, no show had happened would have solved that whole thing. Where were you? I was at class. Oh, yeah, forgot about that. I better put that on my calendar so I remember that in the future. All that stress, all that anger, all that vitriol, all that everything could have been totally avoided. And he wouldn't have looked like a complete idiot when we brought the employee down to have that conversation. So just be open to that communication. Common pitfalls for performance improvement plans. These are things that cause them to fail and that are in your control. So not giving them sufficient time to remedy the performance problem. If you have a set of reports that get run every 3 months, and that's the time period that they are available for, you can't set up a performance improvement plan for somebody who's failing on those reports for 30 days. You've got to give them the full time period so that you can actually see were they successful in fixing that problem or not. So you've got to give them an appropriate amount of time to fix their problem. Make sure that your documentation is clean. Dates and times need to match up with what actually happened. If you forgot to write down the date when you talked to an employee about a particular issue, don't fake it later. Tell us that you don't remember the date. Don't say it was and come up with a date that you think is maybe sort of kind of right. First off, in your documentation, write down dates and times. But if you fail at that some point, don't fake it later and then try to mash it together. Documentation that's inadequate, we talked about that earlier. It needs to actually establish the performance problem, the remedy, what happened since then, and what the plan is going forward. If the plan changes for any reason, and they can, if you're in the middle of a performance improvement plan and things are not working for that performance improvement plan and you think you've identified a better plan, let's talk about it. Let's change the plan. The goal is to make the employee successful, not to sit to a rigid set of rules that we established 4 or 5 weeks ago. So it's okay to change these if they need to, but if we're going to change them, it cannot be done verbally between you and the employee and a handshake. It has to be in writing, documented with the original plan so that we can track that and know exactly what was agreed upon. It's kind of, in that sense, like a contract process. You can't change a contract without an amendment. You can't change these without an amendment. But they can change. We do not allow wiggle room for future poor performance. If a person shows that they are able to be successful on that performance improvement plan, then they have shown they can be successful. Barring some extravagant change in the process that we use to get the same work done, they are now permanently expected to perform to the level that is expected of employees. We talked about giving feedback. You got to just make sure that you're really communicating all the time. You need to hold them accountable. This isn't a plan that we put in place that serves as a warning that we just kind of ignore later on and just kind of fudge our way through. You need to track that, process it, and hold them accountable to that and impose whatever consequence is appropriate. In disciplinary action, you have some pitfalls as well. The biggest one that you see all the time is starting soft. You do not have to, as a supervisor, tolerate bad behavior for a certain period of time before it becomes appropriate to address it. Bad behavior is bad behavior from the very first occurrence. Now, you may not jump in and do a really heavy-handed disciplinary process the first time something happens, but you should be addressing that behavior with an employee. Employees are not required to like each other. They are not required to be each other's best friends. They are not required to engage in small talk about each other's families, their goals, their hopes, their dreams. They don't have to sit around the water cooler. They don't have to have lunch together. They do have to get along under a professional standpoint. They do have to work well together. They do have to share appropriate information between each other so that everybody can get their work done appropriately and properly. They do have to be kind and civil to each other. If they're not, you don't wait. You address it. You establish the expectation and you hold them to that expectation. Incomplete research and analysis, just go back to the story I told you. One 15-second conversation would have been all the research was needed to resolve that issue completely. Make sure you're not doing the same thing even in a smaller scale. Know the issue. Know the details. Don't wait for someone else to do it. If you have been promoted into a supervisory position and you have been given responsibility for people, they're your responsibility. Leadership is not being able to tell people what to do. Leadership is taking care of the people who you've been given as your charge and making sure that they can be successful. So don't think you get to get out of it by just ignoring it. On the flip side, do not abuse your authority. You're their supervisor, not their mother. And even if you are their mother, which you wouldn't be in the state, but even if under some circumstance you are their mother, for the purposes of discipline in an employment setting, you are not their mother. You're their supervisor. You don't get to decide what they like, what they dislike. You don't get to decide their specific personality traits beyond the necessity to be professional. They don't have to like you either. They just have to be professional and following the rules and doing their job. Do not discipline in public. I don't care if their behavior occurred in public. I don't care if that behavior that occurred in public was embarrassing personally to you. Do not discipline them in public. You're the supervisor. You're held to a higher standard. You have to do things in the way that is best modeled for the department. And that means we discipline behind closed doors with confidentiality. If they choose to walk out of that room and share what you said and share what you did and talk about how evil and rude you were and want to share all the details about the discipline that is being imposed that they think is unreasonable, they can do that. But we don't do that. Don't be vindictive. And this really is helpful when you talk with human resources about these things and we get comparables so that we know exactly how the department has engaged different performance problems or discipline problems in the past so that you're consistent with those. It's not ever about you. Even if it is about you, it's not about you. So we engage these in what was the rule that was broken, what is an appropriate discipline for that rule, and what is the plan going forward.
In regards to your comment about the employee can leave and share, is that something as a supervisor or manager that should also be addressed, though, for the department's well-being? If a staff member is disciplined for a justifiable reason behind closed doors and then they go out and are kind of sharing that, is that something to be addressed, or is that not really an HR concern?
You would love it if people would learn to keep their dirty laundry to their own closets. And you would love it if people would be professional and engage in professional communication. But especially as a state agency, your employees have a constitutional right to free speech. And free speech, by the way, is not a constitutional right to say whatever you want whenever you want. And you can place reasonable restrictions on that. Like, for example, you cannot walk into a theater that's crowded and yell fire. That's not a free speech entity. But free speech does mean, and was intended to mean by the Founding Fathers, that they have the right to speak out against the government. You are the government in this case. If they don't like the penalty that's being imposed upon them, they have a right to spread that as far and wide as they want. You just don't have the right to respond to it. So if they want to jump on Facebook and say, you're a horrible, terrible person and you're just unreasonable in your expectations and they hate their job and they just hate working here and they're going to find something different, and you find out about it, it sucks. You wish they wouldn't do that, but don't ever respond to it. And you hope as they grow, especially if they're young people and they're just growing, and you can do trainings where you talk about professional conduct and you talk about maintaining confidentialities and you talk about being professional, that they'll grow that understanding and learn that there are things that they shouldn't share. But some people never learn that, and if they choose to share, you cannot tell them not to. Does that answer your question? I know that sucks as an answer, but don't act when angry. This is really important, and by communicating with human resources, if you'll do that, you will almost always eliminate this possibility. When people do stupid things, it makes you mad. If it doesn't, you're not human. And we recognize that, but you don't want to act in that anger. You are going to act, but you need just that little bit of time to take that cleansing breath, work it out in your head, talk with us about it, come up with an actionable plan that is reasonable and acceptable, and move forward that way. Never engage in discipline while you're angry unless there's a safety issue or some kind of a extreme liability or property damage issue. There are some times where you just have to go in right now. But try to avoid that as much as possible and engage them in a strictly professional behavior. And we've talked about records. Retaliation, I think we've kind of really addressed that, but just make sure when you've addressed an employee's issue, you hold them to that issue, but don't then treat them worse or poorly going forward than you would anybody else. They need to, you address that issue and then it's done if they correct it. It's not something to be held over them for the long run, assuming they correct their behaviors. All right, last little thing here. So run through this for me. A supervisor observes something that may or may not require a performance improvement or disciplinary action plan. Who do you go to first? Do you come to human resources to talk about it? Do you go to your immediate supervisor to talk about it? Do you go to one of us and wait for us to tell you to go to the other? What's the best plan there?
Your supervisor. You should go to your manager.
Okay, I have one vote for your supervisor. Supervisor first. Nobody's going to dispute that one? Everybody likes that answer?
Unless it's your supervisor, you're observing.
Then you go to their supervisor.
Okay,
You're next in line. I think the
Okay.
chain is what I'm.
that chain of command needs to be held and maintained. That is an almost correct answer. It actually is a correct answer, but
Sometimes the first thing that I like to do is go back through my cuff notes and see if there was even an issue with this before, if it's the
Okay.
first time. Maybe this is the first time and I've never had an issue, and then I just need to talk to the employee to correct the immediate
okay, we're going to
behavior.
assume for the purposes of this question, because it specifically gives you two choices, well, three choices, but two people to, we're going to assume you've done that.
Right.
You've looked through your cuff notes, you either have talked to the employee in the past, or it's an issue where it's not something you can just talk to them and move forward with. This is an issue that is potentially going to need a PIP or disciplinary action, or both. Who first?
I think you'd do both simultaneously. You're going to talk to your
Okay.
director, your manager, and make sure that they're on the same page, but then also talk to HR and see even if it is a viable
Okay.
performance or discipline issue. You don't want to go to your director and say, hey, I'm going to discipline this guy, and then find out HR's like, no, you're not going to discipline this guy.
Okay. Yes, no, like, dislike?
Well, I find with my managers and supervisors, if they have an issue, obviously I would like them to staff it with me prior to going to HR, but my response is, we discuss the issue, what it is, and then that's my direction, is let's either together or
Okay.
alone go ahead and give Armand a call. You're on our speed dial, dude.
It's okay, I like being there. So I told you it was an almost correct answer. Yours was also an almost correct answer. Also here. The real answer is I don't care. If you want to talk to your supervisor first, or if your supervisor, your personal supervisor, has a personal preference that you talk to them first, great. If you want to call me first, I'm okay. That's fine. I don't care what order you call us, just that you call. The one caveat that I will absolutely throw in there, though, is that if you have an issue that comes up with your employees and you feel like because your manager's not there that day, or because you just want to run through some options so that you have something to present to your manager, or whatever the reason is, you call me first, you must call your supervisor. Okay, you can't, even after we've discussed it, if you decide, okay, I think I know what I'm going to do now, you still must talk with your supervisor. The last thing you want to happen is for them to later be blindsided by an issue. If you talk to your supervisor and the two of you screen an issue and decide things, and you come up with a plan, and between the two of you, you decide that you can take care of this and you don't need to involve human resources, okay. That is your prerogative, because you are agency management. Human resources is not. We have no authority to tell you as managers and supervisors what you will or will not do. We're here to consult with you, to help you put in best practices, to help you make sure you're doing things that are appropriate and are defensible. But ultimately, it is your decision to decide. So if you consult with me, you must talk with your supervisor. If you can talk with your supervisor, you may need to talk with me, but you don't have to if between the two of you decide that's not needed. Fair? Okay? All right. So you're the front line. And this is one of the areas that I just really want you, especially if you're a line supervisor, to understand this. You're the front line. I'm in an office on the second floor of this building. The likelihood of me seeing and meeting your individual employees and knowing them personally, pretty small. I'm not going to see them every day. I'm not going to watch them walking in late. I'm not going to watch them leaving early. I'm not going to know when they're calling off sick. I'm not going to know these things. I can't track them for you. That's you. So you're going to deal with the day-to-day issues. You've got to be on top of that. You want involved and engaged employees, you need to be an involved and engaged supervisor. You need to be working with each of those people as individuals and treating them like real people and looking at their performance individually and treating them and dealing with those issues as they come up. I can't do it for you. I can just help you understand processes. Your manager's role is to help you and to guide you. That person's in that position because they've had more experience and potentially more training. They're there to help you come up with problem-solving options. And they're part of management, so they actually have authority to make those decisions. Human resources, we're there to consult with you. We're going to give you best practices. We're going to help you understand the rules, laws, and policies that apply, tell you what will and will not work as a defense for your actions. We're going to give you templates that help make sure that you document things properly. We're going to walk through those processes and help you do each and every step, but it's still you and your supervisors and managers that make those decisions. Okay. Questions? See, now you're all sitting here going, why did I let them make me a supervisor? I don't want this. It actually can be awesome. This seems really onerous, but this is the smaller portion, truly. Most of it falls under that employee development, performance management stuff that Bart talked to you about last time. That's a whole lot more fun, a whole lot more enjoyable, and that allows you to build those good relations. This, as hard as it is and as frequent as it feels like it is sometimes, it really is the smaller portion of your responsibilities. It's just really important. Yes?
Okay, so my question is, we move staff around a lot. And so you might, as a supervisor, get new staff. And as a supervisor, not of that person, before, you noticed certain behavioral things that you didn't necessarily like, but they were not your staff at the time. Now they are.
Okay.
So my question is, I get that you would want to set those expectations with your new employees right away. But when you say, not being soft on it, that's where it starts to become a little bit muddy on how long before you really think you need to go to disciplinary.
It doesn't need to be muddy, and it doesn't need to be difficult. If you have an employee that is coming to you from some other place, especially if you know them and you know that they have behavior issues, then within the first few days of them coming on your team, talk to them. Let them know your expectations. Tell them, I know that, and do this very carefully so that you're not ragging on some other supervisor, but you say, I know that in the past you have been able to do X, Y, and Z. You've had the flexibility to come in later than the normal start time. On our team, we don't have that flexibility. We're held to a tighter standard. We're doing a different thing. Whatever the reason is, we don't have that flexibility. So, going forward, I will need you to just be aware, you got to be here on time. The rule says 5 minutes before or 5 minutes after, not outside of that window. Just have that conversation with that individual. It's a conversation you should be having with any new employee. But even a person coming onto your team, you should, within a certain boundary, consider them a new employee. They need to know what you expect as a supervisor, what you feel is important, what you're going to hold them accountable for. So have that conversation with them. Then it doesn't have to be muddy. And when they choose to ignore it and say, well, I don't like that, I like the way we did it on my other team, too bad. That then is a willful choice to engage in conduct that they have been told is not acceptable. That's a discipline issue. Any other questions? Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I don't know, Lance didn't give me any instructions for a wrap-up, so if there's no other questions or any questions there, we'll just consider this done for today. If you have any specific questions that you want to ask afterward, please don't hesitate to come and speak to me or whatever we need to do. Thank you.